On the News Channel 5 network, this is MorningLine.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on Morning Line. Nick Beres here on a Monday. Indeed, hope you had a very good weekend. Gosh, yesterday's weather was terrific, wasn't it? Now we're kicking things off on this Monday, and as always, we've got a great show to start things with you. It's a topic that really has been, I think, on the minds of a lot of people over the past week since the horrible tragedy in Charleston, South Carolina, the church shooting, and what's come out of that since then. And there have been a lot of things that have, but close to home here and across the country, a lot of the debate centering right now on the Confederate flag. Its meaning, what happens. You've heard about a lot of the major merchants across the country choosing to no longer sell items emblazoned with the Confederate flag. Others coming out and saying, hey, this is wrong. This is something that we have a right to have, and it's a historic point of view. Others say it's a symbol of hate. We're going to get into all of that today, and it's not going to be just us, and I'm going to introduce our esteemed guests here in a moment, but also invite you to join in the conversation, because I know a lot of you have very strong opinions on this. The numbers you see on the screen there is 615-737-7587 if you want to jump in the conversation. Want to hear your take on the Confederate flag and all that's happened here in the state of Tennessee and across the country. So we'll get into it now with our guests. Let's introduce them to you. To my immediate left is Gene Andrews, Sons of Confederacy Veterans. Nice to have you on, sir. Thanks for coming on. It's a pleasure. I think you're going to pick up pretty quickly what point of view each of these gentlemen have as we go along. And next to him, it's an honor to have Matthew Walker with us this morning. Sir, thank you. Of course, one of the original freedom riders, civil rights advocate. Nice to have you on, sir.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you both for coming. I thought we would start this off to kind of lay a primer down for our viewers and for me as well, to give you each just a little bit of a chance to talk about what you think of the events of the past week with regard to the Confederate flag, stemming, of course, from that horrible shooting in South Carolina. And why don't we start with you? Your thoughts. And obviously, I think it's pretty clear the Confederate flag's under attack.
Absolutely. And of course, we in the Sons of Confederate Veterans, League of the South, any of the Southern groups, are saddened and deeply troubled for the families that had to go through this thing. Mm-hmm. It's hard to imagine that you're in God's house and something like this can happen to you. You think that's a safe place, and yet it's not. But the thing that is, overreaction to that, mm-hmm. and to blame the Confederate flag for what a crazy nutcase did is, to us, totally over the line. I've seen images posted of this boy that did the shooting with a Gold's Gym T-shirt on. Yeah. So maybe Gold's Gym had something to do with it. I mean, he had that picture. But we understand that in the media and the hype that goes with something like that, for the liberals, the left, the mainstream media, this was a four-run homer because they got a white person that committed a horrible crime against blacks. He was from the South. He used a gun, and they can tie the Confederate flag into it.
He was pictured also with the Confederate flag in that one shot.
Oh,
right?
Yeah, absolutely. But then I was pictured, I have pictures of myself when I was in Vietnam. So if I did something like that, does that mean that all Vietnam veterans are crazy and ready to go in and start shooting up churches?
All right, and we'll get into more of the details, but I understand where you're coming from. You don't like the reaction. You don't think it's fair. Let me ask you, Mr. Walker, your take on it. The fact that people are reacting. I'm thinking that maybe the reaction to the Confederate flag now, unfortunately, it came about after the fact of this horrible shooting, but do you believe it's overdue? I mean, is it offensive to you, the Confederate flag?
I perhaps should answer your last question first. Is the Confederate flag offensive to me? The Confederate flag is offensive to me. When I see the Confederate flag, I see that people are flaunting the fact that their ancestors got away over an extended period of time with considerable crimes. Crimes such as hostage taking, kidnapping, murder, homicide, genocide, causing many suicides, rape, child abuse, elder abuse, litany of crimes against...
All tied under slavery.
All tied under slavery. And that flag represents that period in our history of slavery, and I see it as a slap in the face to black people whose ancestors endured the worst form of slavery known to man. Now, as far as the events of the past week, few weeks are concerned, I think this may be a classic example of silver lining. In other words, a light at the end of the tunnel. In other words, dark days followed by bright days. The dark days, the tunnel being the actual shooting of those innocent people there in the church. And the good that can come out of it is that America can finally come to terms with its long-standing amnesia and denial about slavery. This call to get rid of the Confederate flag, followed by calls to get rid of other icons of that period, may be a stepping stone to America finally coming to grips with those people who made America great. In other words, it was the slaves who made America great, and their contribution as a whole has never been acknowledged by this country. The contribution of the slaves to the greatness of America was so tremendous, so meaningful, so pivotal in the development of the economic power of this country, that there should be, to say the least, a monument to the slaves, a memorial to the slaves, rivaling the Washington Monument, rivaling the Lincoln Memorial.
Now, with regard, I want to stay on point, and you made some good ones in your mind about the Confederate flag. To you, as you hear him say that the Confederate flag's offensive to him and what it represents, and for a lot of people, they hearken back to slavery with that. Can you understand how it might be offensive to some?
Well, there's a lot of misinformation out there, and when you have a government-run school system that propagates misinformation, lies, propaganda, people are going to pick up on that.
Well,
unless you go outside of that to do your own research, and I would ask our viewers today, don't believe anything I say. Don't believe anything this gentleman says. You do your own research, and you look up the information, and you find out for yourself what's fact and what has been told over the years. But let's get back to what he said about the symbolism of the flag.
Okay.
What we need to do, if we follow Mr. Walker's lead here, is ban the U.S. flag, because it flew over slavery from the beginning of the signing of the Constitution up through 1865. It was the northern slave ships flying the United States flags that brought the slaves to this country. There was not one single slave ship chartered out of a southern port. They were from Boston, New Bedford, Providence, Philadelphia, New York. That's who brought the slaves to this country. The wealth of New England was built on the slave trade. And to come up and point your finger at the Confederate flag that only flew over slavery for 4 years and say that's the whole problem with slavery in this country is totally erroneous. And it ignores a lot of history that most people, as he said, have amnesia about. And there was no worse treatment of any people brought into this country as laborers than the Irish. And the way they were treated in the factories and the mines in the North. They lived in worse conditions than the slaves in the South. So you can't just single out one group and say, this group is totally evil and this group is nothing but a bunch of saints. Doesn't work that way. History doesn't work that way.
Mr. Walker?
Well, I agree with Mr. Andrews on one point, and that is that people should research this for themselves.
Absolutely. In
this day of the information superhighway, there's no reason for people not to know about these things.
Yes, sir.
And if you do enough research, you'll find the truth. In other words, as far as the question of the Irish, having been treated more harshly than the slaves, I take issue with that. Again, we're talking research. I happen to have brought with me some examples of some of those instances where slavery happened to have been so horrendous. This particular picture shows one of the
Hold it up just a wee bit there, and she may zoom in a little bit there. Yeah, that's good. Actually, go ahead and describe. You can see in the monitor there, it's above the bar. And
this particular picture displays one of the
hold it right there.
Common types of punishments of slaves. Both individuals are wearing wooden collars. There is one type of wooden collar on the individual to the left, another type of wooden collar on the individual to the right.
Well, and clearly, there's no debating that the slaves and the treatment of them was abhorrent. My question is, though, the Confederate flag, and as it relates to that, you believe is representative of that type of treatment.
The Confederate flag is undoubtedly, absolutely representative of this type of treatment. The Confederate flag that we see today was flown first in December 1861 by the Army of Northern Virginia, the Army of General Robert E. Lee. The only difference between that flag and today's Confederate flag was General Lee's flag was square and today's flag is rectangular. But if that army flew that flag for 4 years of the Civil War, and they were fighting to maintain the Southern way of life, then it's easy to say that the flag represents slavery.
Yeah, and that's the point. I understand what you're saying about the American flag, but that point he just makes, that's why people associate the Confederate flag with the South and slavery, because during those 4 years, much of the Civil War was about slavery. It wasn't all it was about, but you know as well as I do, a lot of the Civil War was about slavery.
That's what we've been taught because the winners write the history books. And they're going to write that version to try to cover up the war crimes and atrocities, things he was talking about, the rape, the murders, the beatings that happened to Southern civilians during the war. The U.S. Army was a brutal, brutal collection of war criminals, about 1863 to 1864, and what they did to the Southern population, black and white. Sure. Black and white. The rape of the black women in North Alabama was just horrendous, some of the stories about that. And in the Carolinas, by the U.S. Army. This is not the Confederate Army, this is the U.S. Army that's doing this. So you can, once again, you have to look at the historical fact of that time. To say that Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was fighting for slavery is totally erroneous, because Lee inherited slaves from his father-in-law because he was too poor. He was in the Army. That's why he joined the Army. So when he married Mary Custis, he took over the Custis Mansion there, which is Arlington today. He inherited his father-in-law's slaves that were working there. He freed them before the war ever started, before slavery was ever an issue at the end of the war. General Grant, his wife, Julia Dent, kept 4 slaves during the entire war. So here's Robert E. Lee in the Confederacy, freed his slaves. Julia Dent, the wife of the Union commander, U.S. Grant, later President of the United States, kept her 4 slaves.
What we'll have to do is we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to take phone calls. And I think we have to be careful we can get into a debate interpreting what we saw during the time of the Civil War.
Sure.
And as it is, and I think you both are going to have a different take on that. I want to take it more into modern times and into the idea of ownership of and use of the Confederate flag. Where do you think it's appropriate, where it's not appropriate? I don't think anyone's saying we should ban it so no one can own it privately. I would be, you want to have a Confederate flag in your front yard, that's fine. A lot of people saying about the flag, publicly flown in South Carolina and elsewhere, not appropriate. We'll get into those issues with you and how you feel about it. And we'll take some phone calls about this. Again, not so much debating the history of it, because I think you both are going to have a different take on that, but where we go now. Yes, sir.
Make one comment about what Mr. Andrews
You can do that
said.
as soon as we come back from the break. Right off the top, I'll let you do that. We've got a whole show till 9 o'clock. We'll be back with more right after this.